Later in 1988, which was and has become the benchmark season for fire management in the United States. The Yellowstone fires and various fires of that nature. At that time, the largest fires we'd ever experienced. The Mink Fire in Yellowstone National Park, the Canyon Creek Fire that escaped the Bob Marshall Wilderness Boundary, became, I think, a 250,000 acre fire, 240,000 acre fire. These were program defining types of fires. Within that, and 12 miles north of the Canyon Creek Fire, was the fire that I managed as a prescribed natural fire, the Gates Park Fire, which became 52,000 acres. Only 3 years before, in 1985, the Charlotte Peak Fire at 5,000 acres was the largest fire in the Bob Marshall since the 30s. 3 years later, we have a 50,000 acre fire and a 250,000 acre fire, and Yellowstone Park is essentially 33% ablaze. Critical resources were already employed all over the country, protecting in the urban interface, protecting high-valued natural resources. There really wasn't anything available to a fire deep in the wilderness. What would be the point from a priority standpoint? I understood that. But I had a real good relationship. As you know, all business, even ours, is built on relationships. And I can remember when I left Kalispell, I called my friend Ron Hendrickson, who was the Region 1 coordinator, and I told him what I was going to do, and I said, I want to make a deal with you. I said, I won't ask for anything unless I absolutely need it. But when I call you, you need to give me what I want, because if you don't, my next call will be from the forest supervisor, and we'll order a Type 1 team and all the resources you have left. Deal? Deal. With that, I had 18,000 acres at the time, 1 helicopter, 20 people, and 6 district people, and myself. And at that time, we had right at 40 miles of perimeter in the first 10 days that we were on the fire. So as we watched this fire, the first thing that I did from my experience of 3 years prior on the Charlotte Peak Fire was I wanted the district's information and the maps that they had developed in the first 30 days of this fire. How did this fire go from 0 to 12 and 18,000 acres in 30 days? What made this fire tick? Was it wind? Was it major wind events? Was it terrain features? Was there a bunch of dead downfall and a high decadence component in lodgepole pine that moved this fire? Because at that time it was the biggest fire I'd ever seen. At the time it was the biggest fire I'd ever heard of. I figured I was taking Goliath on, and my name is David. I was scared to death and excited as hell. And so I got in there, we started looking at it, and initially, like all things that are beyond your comprehension, it was all over the place. And it was 12, 18,000 acres on the go, and the first 10 days that we were there, it grew to almost 30,000 acres. And we had 20 people in a helicopter. And what are we going to do, you know? Well, we're going to do something, but we're not going to do anything until we know what we are going to do. So we rat-holed the guys, and we kept moving camp. It burned us out 3 times, marching us down the South Fork of the Sun River. And finally, and not just me, it was all the people that I had with me. We didn't do anything but try to evaluate this fire. It wasn't really anything 20 guys can do with that kind of a deal. And it finally came that this fire had made 3 major runs in that previous 30-day period. And looking at the topographic features, the drainages that had had major stand replacing runs were all northeast oriented. The wind was prevailing from the southwest. So anytime the wind exceeded the Continental Divide to the west, southwest, which is known as the Chinese Wall, and it surfaced above 12 miles an hour, and the temperatures were above 90 degrees, and the relative humidity was below 18%, this fire took off. So I look back at the data, I look back at the history of the fire, the most recent history of the fire showed to me the basis of the rhythm of the Gates Park Fire. The rest of the time, you could essentially move in and around the perimeter of the fire at will in good safety and do whatever you needed to do on the perimeter, because the stars hadn't lined up yet. Until those three components got in line with the fuel conditions and the topographic features, we could basically be extremely effective on the perimeter of the south flank of that fire. So I called in a fire behavior analyst to provide the empirical data that I would need to test my hypothesis of if this fire is going to go into the base of Biggs Creek, and if it does in the next 3 days, what's the chances of it making a major run? So he came in, looked at the fire, looked at my data, looked at my map, and he said, you got 3 days, maybe 4, or you're going to get blown out of here. So what we did was, when the weather parameters, wind speed, relative humidity, and temperature were below 90% of any of the values that I had found to exceed the capability of our ability to stay on the line and fight this fire, we went and worked on this thing directly. So what we did for the first time is we stalled the southern movement of this fire so it didn't enter the mouth of Biggs Creek when the temperatures got over 90 degrees, the relative humidity got below 18%, and the wind speed surfaced at over 10 miles an hour on the valley floor. When those things happened, we were able to keep the fire almost a quarter of a mile away from the bottom of Biggs Creek drainage. And so when those things happened, the fire reburned throughout much of its interior, but only made a small advancement on the south flank of that fire. And I said, we got a chance here. For the first time in about 2 weeks, we had done something on the perimeter of this fire, which was now approaching 40,000 acres, that had an effect, what I felt was a positive effect on what we were trying to accomplish, and that was to keep the fire within the Bob Marshall Wilderness. Where we were most vulnerable after 2 weeks of observing this fire was, we had no physiographic features, no obvious fuel component on the south flank of the fire that would keep the fire from slowly marching, backing, and making short crown runs to the south. We had no place to anchor, had no safe place to develop a line. It was just continuous rolling lodgepole pine, over mature lodgepole pine savanna, really, with open grassy meadows, grass up to your knees. It was extremely dry. But for the first time, we had stalled the advancement of that south flank, and for the first time in like a week, we hadn't got our camp burned out in the night. Mm-hmm. So that became very important to me from a strategic standpoint. We weren't going to get any more people, we weren't going to get any more equipment, but this fire was going to persist until snow flew on Gates Park. This rhythm issue, it was very important. And has been important to me for the remainder of my career, insofar as identifying that, not knowing it was a rhythm. I had no idea what it was, other than I had a good idea when it was safe to work. It was even more importantly, a good idea when it wasn't safe to work, and the effectiveness of the work on a segment of the perimeter, recognizing we had, I can't remember how many miles of perimeter go around a 50,000 acre fire, but it's a bunch. But only 4 miles of that perimeter on the south flank were available to us and were critical to the fire moving south and exceeding wilderness boundary. On about the last week of August of 1988, we got a good rain, our first good rain all summer. We got 1800s, and it really knocked this fire down. Difference from other fires adjacent to us, we decided to change our strategy and to go direct, which we had always done on other fires. That's where we'd always been successful in suppressing fire, and our role now was to suppress this south flank of the fire as best we could to reduce its capability of exceeding the wilderness boundary. So when it rained, we went direct. We dug 4 mile a line, and then every day after that, or every night after that, whenever the conditions would allow us to do so safely, we started mopping up in the interior as far as we could go. The rest of the fire we couldn't be concerned with, because it's already demonstrated it did not have the ability to exceed the wilderness boundary to the east, but the south flank continued to be a threat every day that the quote-unquote stars lined up for us. So when the wind came This unbelievable wind event occurred on September 6th and 7th. On a 50,000 acre fresh fire, the 4 miles of line that we had developed and held and mopped up in the previous 10 or 12 days held during that wind event, and the Gates Park fire did not exceed the perimeter or the wilderness boundary when all the other fires, Canyon Creek went from almost 70,000 acres to 240,000 acres, threatened Augusta, Montana community, blah, blah, blah. The other fires in Yellowstone Park and other fires made major movements. So recognizing the rhythm of the fire had everything to do with two important things: meeting the objective of the fire, of the Gates Park fire, keeping it within the wilderness boundary, and doing so safely with a very small force.